All right. So Benjamin Jowett tells us that the study of philosophy, if made a serious business, involves grave results to the mind and life of the student. I'll tell you where the quote is. It's from his own introduction to the Sophist in his own translation of all of the dialogues. Assalamu alaikum. And so Benjamin Jowett, as I said, is one of the most important figures in the revival of some notion of Platonism as a living tradition in the West. And he was the master of Balliol, and he translated all of the dialogues. So the complete version, I think the one that Sidi Cream has 5 volumes, one I have has 4 volumes, because it's the less good version, which is usually what happens with us. It's a brilliant translation of all of the dialogues. One of the very interesting things that he does is he provides an introduction, a preface to every dialogue, and he also includes a summary and a study of each dialogue before the dialogue. And he's a man of some philosophical depth, and it's really worth getting hold of, much better than the modern editions, many of which are also worth having. But he says in the preface to the Sophist, the study of philosophy, if made a serious business, involves grave results to the mind and life of the student. For it may encumber him without enlightening his path, and it may weaken his natural faculties of thought and expression without increasing his philosophical power. The mind easily becomes entangled among abstractions and loses hold of facts. The glass, which is adapted to distant objects, takes away the vision of what is near and present to us. So I think this is really crucial if we're going to understand something which is a potential pitfall in the study of philosophy. Ala wa huwa is the question, is the study of philosophy the same as our spiritual path? Or is it necessarily complementary to the spiritual path? Or could you even say that each are dependent upon the other? Or is that just from one direction, or is it from both directions? And I'll read it one more time. The study of philosophy, if made a serious business, involves grave results to the mind and life of the student. Note, he says, if made a serious business. If one is dabbling in philosophy, this is not necessarily going to become a problem. But if you go very, very deep into the structure of concepts and the structure of mind and the structure of all these things, it may have an effect on you. It may not be a good effect, for it may encumber him without enlightening his path, and it may weaken his natural faculties of thought and expression without increasing his philosophical power. The mind easily becomes entangled among abstractions and loses hold of facts. The glass, which is adapted to distant objects, takes away the vision of what is near and present to us. Now, I want to read an excerpt from the Phaedo now, and the Phaedo, and I think in a way, Plato answers this question. I should have said that when Jowett frames what he's saying here, he's saying that this is something which is raised in a particular place in the Republic of Plato. And is there a way to escape from becoming too stuck in a conceptual system such that what one finds is one is really only seeing the conceptual system rather than seeing the reality that it's supposed to uncover? And I think this really gets to the heart of what we're trying to do with the type of work that we're beginning to bring out, and really making this distinction between two types of philosophy. Here's Asif. And then trying to understand why, if the philosophical activity requires a spiritual path, well, then why do we need to bother with the philosophical activity? So Plato says in the Phaedo, do we recognize such a thing? This is Socrates speaking, of course. Do we recognize such a thing as absolute uprightness and absolute beauty and goodness too? Have you ever seen any of these things with your eyes? Have you ever apprehended them with any other bodily sense? By them, I mean not only absolute tallness or health or strength, but the real nature of any given thing, what it actually is. Don't you think that the person who is likely to succeed in this attempt most perfectly is the one who approaches each object so far as possible with the unaided intellect, the man who pursues the truth by applying his pure and unadulterated thought to the pure and unadulterated object? So long as we keep to the body and our soul is contaminated with this imperfection, there is no chance of our ever attaining satisfactorily to our object, which we assert to be truth. The body fills us with innumerable distractions, loves and desires, and all sorts of fancies and a great deal of nonsense. If we do obtain any leisure from the body's claims and turn to some line of inquiry, the body intrudes once more into our investigations, interrupting, disturbing, distracting, and preventing us from getting a glimpse of the truth. We are in fact convinced that if we are ever to have pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body and contemplate things by themselves with the soul itself. It seems, to judge from the argument, that the wisdom which we desire and upon which we profess to have our hearts set will be attainable only when we are dead and not in our lifetime. It seems that so long as we are alive, we shall continue closest to knowledge. If we avoid as much as we can all contact and association with the body, except when they are absolutely necessary, and instead of allowing ourselves to become infected with its nature, purify ourselves from it until God himself gives us deliverance. Purification consists in separating the soul. I'm going to suck off. Purification consists in separating the soul as much as possible from the body and accustoming it to withdraw from all contact with the body and concentrate itself by itself. The desire to free the soul is found chiefly, or rather only, in the true philosopher. In fact, the philosopher's occupation consists precisely in the freeing and separation of soul from body. True philosophers make dying their profession. And then, finally, Plato, in his 7th letter, Plato also has many letters, some of which are basically acknowledged by scholars to be authentic, some others not. And the 7th letter is one of the ones which enjoys most consensus on its authenticity. He says, natural intelligence and a good memory are equally powerless to aid the man who has not an inborn affinity with the subject. Without such endowments, there is, of course, not the slightest possibility. The study of virtue and vice must be accompanied by an inquiry into what is false and true of existence in general, must be carried out by constant practice throughout a long period. Hardly after practicing detailed comparisons of names and definitions and visual and other sense perceptions, after scrutinizing them in benevolent disputation by the use of question and answer without jealousy, at last in a flash, understanding of each blazes up, and the mind, as it exerts all its powers to the limit of capacity, of human capacity, is flooded with light. So the first quote is from Phaedo 65d to 67e, and the second one is from the 7th letter 344a to c. I'm not going to dwell on this any longer, but it's something that we need to consider and will come up very much as the book unfolds. Including at the beginning of this introduction. Is there anyone who's happy to read? Merlin, are you happy to read? Yes, please. Yeah. It's just from here, on page 8.
Al-Kharij, extramental particulars, literally outside, the outside, but meaning outside the mind or extramental, completes the threefold kalam.
Would you be much louder? I'm sorry, this is terrible.
Al-Kharij, extramental particulars, literally the outside, but meaning outside the mind or extramental, completes the threefold kalam and hikmah division of the most general and often overlapping modes of subsistence, within which objects obtain, the other two being al-dhihn, the mind, and nafs al-amr. A recurrent theme in this study is that on some more expansive ontologies, nafs al-amr can constitute a mode of subsistence in which entities can inhere completely independently of both minds and extramental particulars as usually understood. But what precisely are al-Kharij and al-Dhihn? In what sense can they be identified with nafs al-amr, and in what sense can they not? To illustrate the meaning of al-Kharij, let us look at why the restriction particulars has to be added to its English translation, and why, we would argue, translations that simply render the term extramental reality or similar are misleading. In the sense that their existence is not mind dependent, existence in nafs al-amr exists extramentally just as much as Khariji entities do. The fundamental difference between al-Kharij and the broader nafs al-amr is that a Khariji entity refers only to an individual and therefore individuated muta'ayyin entity. Put in simpler terms, an entity that is particularized instantiation of a universal essence, of a universal essence, and therefore capable in principle of being pointed at or otherwise singled out as an individual thing. Like the actual individual person called Zaid, a particular instantiation of human being. This is because extramental existence are necessarily accompanied by individuation and cannot thus exist in uninstantiated form, according to the broadly peripatetic Avicennan and Kalam views. As we will see as the argument of this study unfolds, bias towards the particular and the individual, and in the inevitably vast majority of cases, this means the empirical particular as the primary unit of extramental reality, such that existence becomes a consequence of individuation, does not represent a self-evident conclusion, nor even a demonstrable one. It in fact arises from Aristotle's explicitly anti-Platonic redefinition of primary being or substance, ousia, in his developed account in Metaphysics. For Plato and the Platonic tradition, only the forms can qualify as ousia, in that they are intelligible substrata, in themselves neither universal nor particular, that bestow both being and knowability upon their participating individuals, and that necessarily exist prior to their individuals.
Thank you so much. Sorry. So these are terms which come up again and again in Islamic metaphysics. So we have al-Kharij, we have al-Dhihn, and we have nafs al-amr. And it's no exaggeration to say that there are people who are very respected and advanced students of ilm al-kalam who have probably spent many, many years using these words and may not have had to ever think about what they actually mean precisely, which is problematic. And this is something actually that some of our great ulama say, like Ibn Baha'u'ddin later on, who's a great Ottoman theologian mentioned by Toshko Brizad in Al-Shaqa'iq al-Narmaniyya. He says that everyone without exception uses the term nafs al-amr, but almost no one knows what they mean when they use it. So this is a somewhat important few paragraphs just for understanding the terminology that we're going to see a lot of. So al-Kharij, I've translated as extramental particulars. You'll often find this translated as extramental, but that's not a precise translation. Now, al-Kharij literally means the outside and means outside the mind, hence extramental. And this completes the threefold kalam and hikmah division of the most general and often overlapping modes of subsistence within which objects obtain, the other two being al-dhihn, the mind, and nafs al-amr. A recurrent theme in this study is that on some more expansive ontologies, nafs al-amr can constitute a mode of subsistence in which entities can inhere, completely independent of both minds and extramental particulars is usually understood. But what precisely are al-Kharij and al-Dhihn? So why does the term particulars have to be added to the definition? The reason for that is because it's a principle of ilm al-kalam and falsafa. As we usually understand these terms, when we say al-hukama or we say al-mutakallimun, there's a certain assumption. We're not talking about exceptions that might be found here or there, but awal ma yatabadal ila dhihn is a group of scholars who adhere to a particular school of thought who believe in certain principles. Now, one of those principles shared absolutely across the hukama and the mutakallimun, as usually understood, is that al-wujud yatawaqqafu ala ta'ayyun, or even identifying wujud with ta'ayyun. So if something exists, it means that it makes quite a lot of sense, I have to admit. If something exists, then it has become determinate in a particular way, such that it's there, and you can point to it. Yaqbal al-ishara al-hissiyya. There it is, an existent thing. So this is a kind of common sense understanding of what it means to exist, is to be determinate. If something is not determinate, then it's indeterminate and it's not there. So this can be taken as a kind of common sense definition of existence. And this is a fundamental principle which is generally accepted. Al-wujud yatawaqqafu ala ta'ayyun. Existence depends upon individuation. And existence is a consequence of individuation. And so what are one of the implications of that? One of the implications is if something doesn't have corresponding individuals, then it doesn't exist. Which sounds fine until you start to get into certain difficulties, logical difficulties, metaphysical difficulties, which will be the theme that we'll return to a lot in the book, and that you will usually find dealt with in Platonic, broadly Platonic and Akbarian authors. And I will say very briefly, just so that we have some sort of nakha to what we're talking about, that these basically come down to the idea that there's a type of dawr that is going on if we say that the existence of human nature, for example, depends upon its corresponding individuals. Because obviously the individuals are al-mahiyya ma'al ta'ayyun, but you're saying that they can't exist until they're muta'ayyin. What is it that's becoming muta'ayyin? It's not there. The thing's not there. So how is it becoming muta'ayyin? And so if ta'ayyun, depends upon the mahiyya, which it obviously does, but the mahiyya is not there, then it's problematic. Again, so the mahiyya is depending upon the individuation according to the peripatetic view, in order to exist. But the individuation depends upon the mahia. Otherwise, how could I be an individual of human nature, hopefully, rather than being a tree or something? Because there's something beyond individual human beings which answers which accounts for the possibility of multiple or even almost infinite individuals, the instantiation of this quasi-infinity of possible individuals. But if we make the existence of the nature depend upon a corresponding individual coming to existence, what does that mean? If there were, let's say that all of the human beings in the world were wiped off the face of the earth, and then one was suddenly to come into existence, then we would say that the nature, human nature, has come into existence with that one individual. And it's a bit like saying that the bed, which is obviously on that peripatetic view, just these individuated elements, which then are brought into certain relations by the person who makes them, didn't exist as a blueprint in the mind of the person before it was brought into existence. But there are complexities and difficulties, and there are facile solutions, and there are all sorts of things, but that's not our mabhath at the moment. So, as we will see as the argument of this study unfolds, bias towards the particular and the individual, and in the inevitably vast majority of cases, this means the empirical particular, as the primary unit of extramental reality, such that existence becomes a consequence of individuation, does not represent a self-evident conclusion, nor even a demonstrable one. It in fact arises from Aristotle's explicitly anti-Platonic redefinition of primary being or substance, ousia, in his developed account of Metaphysics Zeta. For Plato and the Platonic tradition, only the forms can qualify as primary being, and that they are the intelligible substrata, in themselves neither universal nor particular, that bestow both being and knowability upon their participating individuals, and that necessarily exist prior to the individuals. If we go to note 20, you don't have to, I'll read it to you if you can't find it, but for the pervasive myth apparently concocted by, this is on page 169, for the pervasive myth apparently concocted by Aristotle himself, that in his doctrine of forms, Plato is affirming the transcendent existence of universals. See Lloyd Gerson's landmark study, which argues for the governing role of Platonism with respect to all subsequent forms of genuine philosophy, Platonism and naturalism, the possibility of philosophy. So it's often thought that Plato is rather absurdly positing this, for the, corresponding to the tables here, there's a whole nother set of mystical tables in the sky which are allowing this table to exist, and that the universal of table exists as a universal, and this is obviously ridiculous, and of course Aristotle devotes a lot of time in his Metaphysics to refuting this view, and quite rightly, because it's a ridiculous view, but it also happens to be not Plato's view at all. As we'll see, but so this is not a universal kind of hypostasized as a concrete being, which is up there in a kind of heaven of floating vast tables and so on, but rather this is a spiritual reality which we don't have direct acquaintance with. It's not like, let's say in the case of human being, the human being who is here, but it's a ma'na, it's a spiritual reality which makes it possible for there to be a one over the many, and thereby accounts for the intelligibility of the world. Again, if the existence of natures depends upon individuation, then it's actually Hasan and Man and Sidi Yusuf who are making human nature be what it is, such that it is distinct from the sky, it's distinct from azakumullah, other animals, it's distinct from, well, it's actually me and you who are making it happen, because it's only through us that the nature can exist. Whereas on the Platonic view, on the Akbarian view, on the Suhrawardian view, on the view of many other varieties of philosophy, there is a spiritual reality which is the one over the many, underlying. There are a lot of questions appearing here, but I'm afraid you're going to have to tell them to me in person. I mean, with your voice, because as I said, I've got a little bit of a problem with this thingy bob. But don't do it now, because my fragile mind will lose its train of thought. So just we'll have time for that if you don't mind in just a while. But on the Platonic view, there is a spiritual reality underlying the particulars of any given species, which is the one over the many, making the being and the knowability of those things possible. But that thing itself is not the same. It's not just a copy of the individuals here. It's an archetype of the individuals here. And who do we say is the essence of human nature? Is al-haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya. So I just wanted to throw that in there to show the pertinence of mysticism to philosophy. But it's only, and then, you know, the other natures of things are understood in our tradition to be branches of the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya. And there are all sorts of complexities that we don't want to get into now, but the point is, the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya is not identical to the temporal person of the Prophet ﷺ, but it is the Prophet ﷺ. But it is also the human nature which runs through all other human beings. But it's a kind of paradigm. It's a kind of fadlaka, but it's a kind of epitome of all that is possible for human nature in terms of its wajh onto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of the way in which the Prophet ﷺ is I mean, all these words are not appropriate, but is as if the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya is as if a template for all of the possibilities that exist within human nature. And I'm not talking about the hasha any naqa'is, because those are all privations and those are the absence of something which is good, but all of the good things in human nature which can become manifest in individual human natures. Why is that? Why is it that Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is joins between perfect Jamal and perfect Jalal, but Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Umar and Sayyidina Uthman, Sayyidina Ali, they had intensifications, as is well known. They had intensifications of particular attributes. But the Prophet ﷺ had all of these attributes in perfect harmony and perfect balance. Why? Because he is the most perfect madhar of the divine nature. And the divine nature in no way becomes manifest in anything, but it becomes manifest in a weaker sense in the sense that it becomes visible in a Manawi sense. Something of the nature of the divine being becomes visible in madahir, in loci of manifestation. The most perfect locus of manifestation is al-haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya, which is also the archetype of human nature. But we'll go into that more. So for Plato in the Platonic tradition, only the forms can qualify as ousia, and that they are the intelligible substrata, in themselves neither universal nor particular, that bestow both being and knowability upon their participating individuals, and that necessarily exist prior to the individuals. For Aristotle, substance is form, insofar as form is the cause of the being of a compound material substance. But form can only exist immanently in a particularized hylomorphic fusion. Yes. So let's do a bit of, oh no, before I do that, I have to read a bit from Findlay, apparently. 251. So this is Ascent to the Absolute by J.N. Findlay. Yes. So this is on one of the lists of books that was sent out. I hope that people, oh no, I sent a PDF of Towards a NeoNeoplatonism, which is this particular thing here. But I'd like you to, well, I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do, because he's a brilliant writer, brilliant mind, brilliant soul, and I think I'm reading this by way of a little bit of commentary of what we've just discussed. What then is the immense revisionary reappraisal which distinguishes a Platonic categorization of the world from an ordinary one? We do not give the right answer if we say with Aristotle, who was probably excluded from the inner Platonic assemblies, and who was certainly incapable of a full entry into Platonic thought, that it consists in setting up beside the things that we ordinarily acknowledge another set of supposedly explanatory or causative entities that merely add to the number of what we originally had and do not make them more countable or otherwise easier to deal with. This is utterly wrong, since the precise point of Platonism is that one does not leave undisturbed the ontological claim of the ordinary things of this world, but dissolves it entirely, as in the things of this individual world are not true being, since it regards the so-called things in the world as things only in a qualified derivative sense, while the only true things in the world, the only things that truly are or can be, are natures or characters such as being alive, being just, being equal, and so forth. To the ordinary or the Aristotelian mind, these natures or characters are things parasitic upon the individual things that exemplify them or instantiate them. Again, because this is what Ibn Baha'u'ddin is about to say, I think. No, not quite, but I mean, it's related, but there's another quote where he does say exactly this, and this is a feature of the Akbarian critique of kalam immanentism, of Aristotelian immanentism, which is they are making all of the intelligible representation of the world, i.e. all of our mental concepts, simply derivative and kind of parasitic upon the individual. The individual is what's really there. Our concepts are not really real. They just come from that, and we don't really know what they are. But the real thing is that individual thing. So to the ordinary or the Aristotelian mind, these natures or characters are things parasitic upon the individual things that exemplify them or instantiate them. They exist in the latter, or are descriptive of them, while the individual things have no such dependence upon these natures or characters, but simply include them as their appendages. To Platonism, however, this ordinary view of things is completely misguided. It is the things of ordinary experience which are in truth parasitic upon the true things or forms, and which are merely the multitudinous reflections or instantiations of these true things, and nothing in themselves at all. We must learn a new talk in which being just and the just itself are the truly substantival locutions, while expressions of instantiation here or there, or now or then, merely qualify or modify such substantival locutions. And we must learn a new self-predication of such truly substantival locutions, which gives rise to no difficulties as long as it is not confused with the old predication, which is merely the converse of instantiation. As Muhammad Sami, who's a scholar of Akbarianism, who's here, at one point, I remember him telling me that one of the Akbarian principles is that al-ta'ayyun yaqtadi sabq la ta'ayyun alayhi. And so this is rather like what we have here. The ta'ayyun of something is a ta'ayyun of something which is not itself ta'ayyun. Otherwise, well, we wouldn't need the new muta'ayyin thing. So al-ta'ayyun yaqtadi sabq la ta'ayyun alayhi. So there has to be something which is not muta'ayyin in the way the thing we're trying to explain is, that has become ta'ayyun, that is a modification, an individuation of something which is in itself not muta'ayyin, at least not in the same way. So it's a determination, it's a qualification that we the inversion we're describing is abundantly spelled out in the Republic, Timaeus, and elsewhere, but never really got through to Aristotle. I love this. Though it sufficed to make him a tortured dualist, one who believes in ordinary individual things and also in species or natures, which in a paradoxical manner tell us what these individuals are. One would have thought the plain answer to the question, what they are, is that they are these or those individuals. And by buttressing his half-held individualism, I love the way he calls it individualism, Aristotelian individualism, by rejecting at least the generic universals to which Plato had given the same status as the specific ones. And the other categories of quality, quantity, etc., are then all with satisfaction declared to be parasitic upon being in the primary sense. What does that mean? What we discussed the other day, the poem with Zayd and all that stuff, you know, substance, quantity, quality, relation, etc., etc. These are all parasitic upon the real individual thing for Aristotle. Are then all with satisfaction the categories declared to be parasitic upon being in the primary sense, whether this last be that of the species or the individual. In this tortured ontology, which is rather a long worry than a definitive doctrine, he's talking about Aristotle in the Metaphysics, we have strong indirect support for the basic positions of Platonism. The basic strength of Platonism lies, however, in its appeal to our imagination, our understanding, and our sense of values. It appeals to our imagination since it recalls us from the dull identification of objects and the dull recognition of them as being thus and thus circumstance, to the more colorful, immersed entry into their character and situation, which is in a sense the background possibility that identification and factual determination presuppose. It is by the generic content of our references and assertions that they manage to hit targets, and such content is soon seen to be a more interesting and fundamental thing than the dull targets that it enables us to hit, or the mere fact of hitting them. Nothing is more insignificant than who or what a thing or person is, and whether or not it or he is really thus or thus circumstance. Though it is of the most immense concern to all but the grossest dullard what it is to be this or that sort of thing, or to be thus or thus circumstance. Our understanding, likewise, speedily moves to the insight that while we may be inclined to look in the direction of particular embodiment for a paradigm of what is, we soon find that we cannot successfully pin down such particularity in its purity or identify it in varying contexts and occasions. All that is substantial, invariant in it, is a pattern, a character, a set of suches which we hail and name on every occasion of their appearance. This character or pattern is all that we can grasp and handle in thought on many occasions, and introduce to and consider with others. The existence of an individual seems to be no more than the fact that certain identifiable, recognizable universals are instantiated and reinstantiated. The identity of such universals, so far from being a derivative, metaphorical sort of identity resting on resemblance or whatnot, as in ideas of nominalism, that there's no such thing as a nature or universal. There's particular things, and then I noted, well, hold on, that one is similar to that. Is that it's only by looking at the resemblances amongst individual objects that we say, there's a nature, but the nature is not thereby rendered real in any sense of real being, but rather it's just the individuals that exist. And I notice resemblances, right? That's a straw man version of nominalism. So the identity of such universals, so far from being a derivative, metaphorical sort of identity resting on resemblance or whatnot, reveals itself as in truth a paradigmatic sense of identity, to which all other senses of identity merely add complications or overtones. Only by practicing the Platonic inversion can we justify science and scientific knowledge, which would be quite impossible if we had to plumb individuals exhaustively. I wanted to go on, but I think this is too much reading. So I welcome you to, I encourage you to read that wonderful article, In Ascent to the Absolute, Towards a Neoplatonism. I know that some people may understandably be sensitive about the word Platonism. In my fanatical days, of early study of the Ilm al-Kalam, I would have been as well. Not saying any of you are fanatics or anything, but the point is that it's just a word. You can leave Plato out of it entirely. The important thing is what he says, and al-hikmatu dhallatul mu'min, and know the truth not by its men, but know the truth by no men by the truth, but also know the truth by the truth. So Platonism is meant in a very, very broad sense. Maulana al-Sheikh al-Akbar, of course, says that it's very rare for people who are philosophers to have, he says that anything, whatever, its true nature can be known by kashf. And it's very rare for philosophers to have anything to do with kashf. They're mostly just logic chopping, going around in circles with their concepts. But one of the exceptions is Aflatun al-Ilahi. And he says one of the few exceptions to that is Plato. And then he says the only reason people have a problem with philosophy amongst the people of Islam is because then have a problem with him is because they're not aware of the signification of the term philosophy, which he then says he has this amazing Greek etymology. He says means, which was very well known to the Muslim scholars. That particular etymology was philosophia, which means love of wisdom. And then he goes on. And then he says that the original teaching comes from the, and this became very basic to our tradition, that the asl of the teaching of many of the great philosophers was the baqaya of the ulum of the Anbiya, particularly Sayyidina Idris. I hope that Sidi Maulana Kareem will share something about that in the future, because I know that he's looked into that extensively. But in any case, so back to the top of page 9. For Aristotle, substance is form insofar as form is the cause of the being of a compound material substance, but form can only exist immanently in a particularized holomorphic fusion, Avicenna's general anti-Platonic discourse and specific polemic against the forms is largely derived directly from Aristotle and informs his own immanentist teaching. So, going to look at Halomorphism now. So, this is waving a book around al-musalsal bil-awwaliyya, because I saw my sheikh doing this, and I'm sure he saw his sheikh doing it. So, this is an individual object. Now, on Aristotle's account, this is a real being. This is real being. This is, you know, to ontos on, it's real being. And you have two basic aspects to it, which are huyula and sura. Ibn Sina adds al-sura al-jismiya to al-sura al-naw'iyya. So huyula is not this. You can't see huyula. Huyula is not, you can't see it ever. Huyula is just the pure potentiality that exists, which we call matter or prime matter. It's the intrinsic thing about existence which makes it possible for material stuff to come into being. But it's only when huyula becomes determinate because of becoming fused with a sura that we have an individual object happen. So what is the sura jismiya in Ibn Sina? The sura jismiya, lahadu, is this, the fact of extension. So the fact that you have that much extension, and then here, and then here, and then here, that's the sura jismiya. So it's extension. Now, of course, what did Descartes then say a body just is? He said it's just extension. So he doesn't, and that opens the door to the mathematization anyway. So that is the sort of jismiya. The sort of naw'iyya is what the thing is. What the thing is it's a book. It is the spiritual meaning, if you like, which is not how they express it at all, but it's the essence of the thing which makes it this particular matter individuated object rather than this one. And let's not get into the debate about man-made objects, but this one has a different sura naw'iyya to this one. That's why this one's a microphone and this one's a book. But this one also has its sura jismiya, which is the extension, right? So for Ibn Sina, you have huyula, which is the pure potentiality. Then you have the sura naw'iyya, which is what type of thing it is. And then you have the sura jismiya, which is the actual extension, the actual determination that happens to happen, that it happens to have. So there, that's Aristotle. So in the post-Razian kalam reception of Avicenna, subsequent to his substantial integration into the kalam curriculum, Avicenna's teaching goes on to intermingle with previous broadly immanentist kalam doctrines to produce decisive formulations stating the putative necessity that existence must depend upon individuation as a particular, which were in turn made subject to Akbarian critiques, such as that of Ibn Baha'u'ddin. Akbarian critiques, by the way, which were not really influenced by Platonism. And we actually do know that. Sorry to sound like an academic, I've spent too long in the university. We actually do know that now with our rapidly increasing body of knowledge that we know, which is, we do know that with a fair degree of certainty, because we know pretty much the type of Neoplatonic sources that are available. and we know pretty much the degree to which they were employed by. We understand pretty much how they developed and where they went, and you didn't have the pure Platonism of the forms. What you had was a Platonism which thought that it was Aristotle, because the main Platonic texts that were transmitted to the Islamic world were paraphrases of Neoplatonic texts. There's actually very little real Plato, but Neoplatonic texts, very good ones, were Plotinus's Enneads, which became the theology of Aristotle, and then what's his name, Proclus's Elements of Theology, which became Kitab al-Idah fil Khair al-Mahd, which I'd like to actually read some of both of them with you, because they're very interesting. Definitely influenced hugely later Islamic thought, but the point is, this is a kind of mishmash of the Enneads with whatever the person doing the paraphrase himself thought. It's a creative paraphrase. It's not just a paraphrase. It's missing half of Plotinus's own doctrine, and then there are subtle changes that happen, such that the doctrine becomes more easily harmonizable with Aristotle. The way that certain terms are translated to become more ontological and less henological, and there's all sorts of things that I would like to look into with you a bit at some point. But so, as I'm saying, these Akbarian critiques here, when it says Akbarian critiques such as that of Ibn Baha'u'ddin, these are not just slavish Platonic copies. And I think, again, this should be something extremely interesting to us. What that means is anyone can discover these things on their own. You know, if you left, Sidi Ahmed in a room on his own, and he did lots of meditation and reflection, he too could come up with all of this himself. He doesn't need to read Plato. Why? Because reality is intrinsically intelligible. It is not something that we construct. We don't make our vision of the universe and then say, here, there it is. We uncover what is there. And so there were all, Samuel Taylor Coleridge said every human being, we've only got 24 participants now because I'm afraid all the Americans have had to go, but Samuel Taylor Coleridge said that every man is born either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, which is an interesting way of looking at it. But there will always be people who see that there's something wrong with this empiricist way of looking at the world. And it will be the same kind of things over and over again. So anyway, Akbarian critiques such as that of Ibn Baha'u'ddin, which refers to those whose purview is restricted to outward appearances and who have restricted being to that lowest of its degrees, which they call extramental existence, al-wujud al-khariji. They thus say that if a quiddity is not individuated, it does not exist, making existence into a subsidiary of individuation. The truth of the matter is that the degree of being is prior to all other of the degrees, that is, the degrees of genera and species, to say nothing of the degree of individual particulars. Al-Kharij can be used in different contexts. In most cases, it is synonymous with particularized essences. Do you mind coming and reading again, Maulana? Because I just think that my voice is getting a bit
Al-Kharij can be used in different contexts. In most cases, it is synonymous with particularized essences. Al-A'yan. Al-Kharij is also used as a synonym for Nafs al-Amr, although this is uncommon. When it is taken to mean particularized essences, which is how it will be used in this study in accordance with its dominant usage across the broad sweep of later Islamic thought, it refers to individuals which instantiate a nature, Zayd, Amr, William, or John, for example, who embody or instantiate the nature man. Moreover, this person, this tree, and this mountain, that is the person, tree, or mountain that one can physically point out, and so on. Without the restriction particulars, then, Al-Kharij would be indistinguishable from Nafs al-Amr. As we will see throughout this study, defining Al-Kharij as extramental particulars correctly ensures that it is of an immeasurably more limited scope than Nafs al-Amr properly construed in its Platonic Akbarian tahqiq for Nafs al-Amr, but includes but is not bound by particularization. It must be granted that in the context of certain sciences, the simple identification of Nafs al-Amr with, for example, extramental particulars, al-Kharij, gives the impression of being a matter of simple common sense. One amongst innumerable similar examples can be found in Ibrahim al-Bajuri's work on Islamic law, Hashia ala Ibn Qasim, where in the course of a discussion of admission of rights, Iqrar, he says, quote, "The impermissibility of making a false admission of debt when the intention is to deprive heirs of their rights is undoubted, as it is impermissible for the person for whom the admission was made, al-muqarr lahu, to take the payment if he knows that the person making the admission is not telling the truth in Nafs al-Amr," end quote. Here, Nafs al-Amr is simply the context of social relations, the actual state of affairs regarding which one could not truthfully say that a hypothetical individual had owed an alleged lender money. In this context, Nafs al-Amr, conceived as extramental particulars, al-Kharij, seems, at least at first sight, to adequately account for the situation's possible truth value. If the man is telling the truth about the debt, it is because in an event in the past, money had actually been received from the person for whom the legal admission of a debt was made. His words would thus correspond to Nafs al-Amr. On the surface, then, it would be plausible for Nafs al-Amr in this context to simply constitute al-Kharij. In this case, the physical substances and properties of the lender and the debtor, and the physical form of the money they exchange. Yet, when we subject this situation to philosophical scrutiny, even in this commonplace situation, there is a problem with stopping at al-Kharij. What of the intelligible concept of a debt, which has no extramental individuated subsistence, must the mind now be brought to bear to supplement al-Kharij? Of course, the identity of Nafs al-Amr is not the subject matter of Islamic jurisprudence, any more than the nature of abstract concepts is. Thus, the jurist must, quite correctly, assume an apparently common sense notion of Nafs al-Amr, or else, if he is more philosophically inclined, turn to the discipline that actually has the determination of the real identity of Nafs al-Amr as part of its subject matter, namely metaphysics. Money physically changing hands is a phenomenon pertaining purely to the spatial motion of substances. Conversely, the notions of ownership and borrowing, the obligation to submit to a time-conditional agreement regarding the return of wealth, are purely intelligible entities which have no form of strictly physical instantiation. Again, non-acknowledgement of this fact poses no problem to the discipline of Islamic law, which rightly does not inquire into ontological statuses. Rightly, that is, if we presuppose the traditional adherence to a subordinated model of strictly demarcated sciences, in which the special subject matter of the specific sciences is respected, yet in which the full coherence and intelligibility of even the specific sciences depends upon knowledge of the universal science of metaphysics, and in other contexts of revelation. That is, a common sense notion of Nafs al-Amr is sufficient for fiqh's native purposes, but only someone with a knowledge of metaphysics will be able to place the domain, ontologically speaking, in which fiqh truly operates. One example of a different type of difficulty for interpreting Nafs al-Amr is presented by Ibn Kathir's use of Nafs al-Amr in his exegesis of Quran, Surah Baqarah, verse 188. "Consume not your goods between you in vanity, neither proffer it to the judges, that you may sinfully consume a portion of other men's goods, and that wittingly." The ruling of a judge does not change anything in Nafs al-Amr. It does not make permissible in Nafs al-Amr something which is really impermissible, nor does it make impermissible something that is really permissible. It is only that the judge's ruling is outwardly binding. If it corresponds to Nafs al-Amr, then well and good. End quote. The clear implication here is that there are objective moral and legal truths. Something does not become right because a judge has said that it is so. Rather, it is only truly right if it corresponds to Nafs al-Amr. Clearly here, the mind and extramental particulars are both irrelevant as guarantors of this objectivity. Moral and legal truths cannot become individuated in particulars, which precludes al-Kharij serving as this guarantor. Moreover, although objective moral and legal truths obtain in minds, they are not derived from minds, which is exactly the point of Ibn Kathir's words above. Rather, in discerning moral and legal truths, the minds correspond to something necessarily extramental. Otherwise, these truths would indeed come into existence at the very moment the judge makes his ruling, and be entirely contingent upon the judge's ruling, and would thus count as utterly subjective. Yet where are these moral and legal truths? Ibn Kathir is clearly referring to God's true law as opposed to the jurist's possibly inaccurate conception of it. But where is God's law, which is true in Nafs al-Amr? Yet another illustrative example of one of the types of questions of question raised by the use of Nafs al-Amr correspondence, of the Nafs al-Amr correspondence theory in diverse scholastic contexts, comes from a very different type of book. Abdul Razak al-Kashani's mystical exegesis of the Quran, often mistakenly attributed to Ibn Arabi himself. Quote, "O my father, I saw 11 planets, and the sun and the moon, I saw them prostrating to me." This is an example of a dream vision. In our exegesis of Surah Hud, we noted that these dream visions require an interpretation. In this case, such an interpretation would explain why, from the lofty souls of Yusuf's family, whose prostration to him was, from the unseen, shown to his soul, Yusuf's imaginative faculty, al-mutakhayyila, moved to the planets, the sun and the moon, which were in Nafs al-Amr none other than his parents and brothers. In the context of Kashani's Akbarian ontology, the planets, the sun and the moon in the verse are manifestations in the world of imaginal representation, alam al-mithal, of Yusuf's parents and brothers, peace be upon him. And this is a fact this is a fact that is true in Nafs al-Amr. According to this ontology, all essences are simultaneously manifest in numerous degrees of being, one of which is the world of imaginal representations, in which essences appear in numerous subtle bodily forms. This manifestation in the world of imaginal representations is itself only a more limited locus of manifestation, madhar, of their existences in the world of spirits, alam al-arwah, and of their ultimate subsistence in the immutable archetypes of God's knowledge. Their existence in the sensible world of extramental particulars is simply the final level of manifestation of their essences. Thus, the proposition the planets, sun, and moon in the world of imaginal representations signified, in a particular context, Yusuf's family members, cannot derive its truth from corresponding to extramental particulars, the mind, or indeed to alam al-mithal. On this Akbarian ontology, our familiar world that we experience with the help of our five senses for our purposes here, the world of extramental particulars, is subordinate to alam al-mithal, so it would be absurd to say that a proposition involving alam al-mithal could derive its truth from corresponding to a level of manifestation more limited than itself. Neither can alam al-mithal be the ultimate guarantor of the truth relation, because since, like extramental particulars, it also constitutes a subordinate level of being, it cannot ultimately have determined what sort of relation should obtain between itself and other levels of being. On this account, then, Nafs al-Amr must be something beyond both extramental particulars and alam al-mithal, and must constitute a degree of being in which the type of relation should obtain between them is determined. Scholastic contexts, which naturally adopt some form of common sense or even neutral attitude towards ontology, as in the example cited from Bajuri, require only very minimalistic accounts of the nature of Nafs al-Amr in order to be justified on their own terms. The example from Ibn Kathir is more clearly perplexing, and Kashani's use of Nafs al-Amr exists at the other end of the spectrum of its use in, say, fiqh, presupposing a complex and explicitly affirmed ontology. It also demands a sophisticated concept of Nafs al-Amr wide enough to account for how relationships between different degrees of existence could have ever been determined. Indeed, exactly because of the Akbarian account's subtlety and scope, a central argument in this study will be that the identification of Nafs al-Amr directly entailed by the Akbarian ontology is the sole broad theory able to truly and fully account for the existence of objective truths, and indeed the very phenomenon of truth, regardless of whether or not that Akbarian ontology is accepted in all its details.
I think that part pretty self-evident. So let's move to any discussion points that we may have. Is there anyone who'd like to? Of course. Could you ask it here, Maulana, because they've always asked me to be very careful.
Yeah, it's just a very quick question about the difference between the Hiyula and the Amal in the Akbarian tradition, the Barzakh, which is between the and
Oh,
the ama, which is like the manifestation of Allah's yani being, through which with the ayan the things would go. Is there a difference between hiyula and...
Absolutely, that's a wonderful question. Maulana Man. The term huyula is actually used in the Akbarian tradition, and it's used in a way which is it's used in a number of different ways in actual fact. But I mean, I'm familiar with the term ama to mean the pure existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in martabat la ta'ayyun, like al-wujud al-mutlaq, al-ama. I don't think I'm familiar with the usage that you're talking about, but the term hayula is used in the Akbarian tradition, and it's actually identified with the level of, it's also called al-anqa, the phoenix. Why? Because the anqa is able to keep on coming into existence. You know, the phoenix is a mythical bird which manages to cyclically regenerate itself, and so there's a potentiality there which allows for the things to come into existence, and so this is a particular martaba in the Akbarian tradition, which is the school of al-Shaykh al-Akbar, which is prior to the martaba of the emergence of the sensible world, alam al-mulk.
Samsidi, I have a few questions, if nobody else wants to go first.
Please, Habibi.
So I have two questions, right? So one is probably a quicker one to answer, maybe. So it's about the distinction that you mentioned Ibn Sina makes, and I guess people after him make, between the Surah Nawawiyya and the Surah Jismiyya, right? As to if you knew where the best discussions or most kind of rigorous discussions about what this means, the differences are in Ibn Sina and elsewhere, and how and where you'd put the natural universal into this, how that notion compared to either of these, right? Because I think you mentioned the natural universal a while ago, like in the first session or something. So yeah, so what's the relationship between the natural universal and the Surah Nawawiyya and Jismiyya, and where can I find the best discussions on it? So that's the first question.
Wonderful. The hold on. Where have I gone? The best discussions of that are, well, one very good place to look would be Razi's commentary on Ibn Sina's Uyun al-Hikmah, for example. But basic discussions could be found, which would probably be more useful for all of us, just to get started, and then we can move on to the other ones, would be in any work of maqulat. There are a number of very, very good works on al-maqulat. One is al-Sija'i's maqulat. Why would it be in works of maqulat? It's because substance is the first of the maqulat. So that's where you basically go in order to find out about maqulat. Al-Sija'i's work on maqulat. There's also there's a book by Mullah Ramadan. What's his full name? I know he's here. The first work of philosophy I really ever studied with my sheikh, Muhammad Ramadan Abdullah. Why do I think his name is Mullah Ramadan? Al-Maqulat al-Ashir Bayn al-Falasifa wal-Mutakallimin. There's a version published in Istanbul, Hashimi and Yayanevi, 2016. That's a very, very good introduction, and you can find that online, as far as I recall. That's a very, very good book where you'll find, you know, a basic introduction to the Surah Naraya and Jismiya, which is very useful. Another place to look would be just the relevant sections on the maqulat in Sharh al-Mawaqif and Sharh al-Maqasid. Usually the maqulat, they are a part of general metaphysics in, not that we use the term general metaphysics, but it is still a useful term to use. And it comes after the Umur Amma sections, usually directly after. So that's another place you could find discussion of this, definitely. Now, the natural universal would correspond naturally to the Surah Naw'iyya, not to the Surah Jismiya, because the Surah Jismiya would be something that you would investigate usually under Maqulat al-Kam, really. I mean, it is, Ibn Sina is saying it is a type of substance. And there is a taqsim, we might say individual substance is the halomorphic fusion, but there are also other accounts of different types of substance. The aql is a substance, the nafs is a substance, the huyula is a substance, the Surah Jismiya is a substance, the Surah Naraya is a substance. So that would be on a broadly Avicennan account of philosophy, that there are broadly these different types of substances. But when we're talking about the individual substance, i.e. a body, it's a composite of the huyula, the Surah Naraya and the Surah Jismiya. What would the natural universal exactly correspond to? I've been going through with a dear friend recently who's working on a book, these kind of kalam attempts to either affirm the natural universal or to reject the notion of the natural universal, al-kulli al-tabi'i, all working within these immanentist frameworks. And it's a bit of a mug's game, really, to be honest with you, in my opinion. But I mean, it is a raging discussion. But I think the basic way to look at it is that, when you're talking about the natural universal, you're talking about a universal. So what are the three types of universal that you have in our tradition, which are not really different types in a certain sense, but the logical universal, the natural universal, and the intellectual universal, which is the two of them together. And so that's the universal which obtains when you see the extramental particular thing and you have your logical universal and you're like, that's a universal. And then you have the intellectual universal. Now, that is, so, when we're talking about the natural universal, how does it differ from the Surah Naraya? Yes, they are both the thing which makes the thing what it is. But what we're trying to account for when we're talking about the natural universal is the universality aspect. Whereas what we're talking about when we talk about the Surah Naraya is the what it is aspect, regardless of universality. So there's obviously a lot of crossover, but they can't be strictly identified, no. One is more of an epistemological question. How do we come to know about this thing that is a distinct essence, but in terms of its universality? And that's different to asking, well, what is it about the thing which makes it what it is in the first place?
Thank you for that. I have another question, but I think somebody else perhaps should go first.
Do you need more time to formulate it, or is it for
No,
reason?
I have the idea. I can give you the question right away.
Okay, let's just do that.
So I'm thinking a little bit about the Neoplatonist understanding of Aristotle, and my question is more or less the following. We do know that a lot of Neoplatonists did try to incorporate some aspects of Aristotle into their articulation and their philosophical vision, and in some cases incorporated within within their Neoplatonist framework. Having said that, are you familiar with let us say, the most strident Neoplatonists who were most stridently, let's say, critical of Aristotle, which ones would they have been? And are there any that would have gone so far as to say that Aristotle
he was a kafir?
Yeah, that he's not a philosopher. He's not a true philosopher. If you have any thoughts on that, that would be good to hear.
Great question. I thank you for asking it, because it's one of the things which is important. How do you do this? Now, this is really important because there's a common perception that all of the later Neoplatonists, whether it's Proclus or Iamblichus or Simplicius or whoever it happens to be, are all raging harmonizationists, and that they believe that Aristotle and Plato can be completely harmonized. Now, one thing is very important to realize. It is true that late Neoplatonism believed in the harmonization as a principle of interpretation. When you are looking at the works of Plato and Aristotle, you should take as a principle of your interpretation that there is an underlying harmony between the two thinkers. That's true. What's also true is they thought categorically that Plato was the superior philosopher, very, very explicitly. Lastly, this phenomenon of the harmonization comes in later. That's also very important to recognize. The harmonization develops after Porphyry. Porphyry is seen as being, in some ways, rescuing aspects of the Aristotelian curriculum from just being thrown out by the Platonists. And he's seen as having rehabilitated the doctrine of the categories after Plotinus's devastating attack on the categories, which happens to also be the subject of my doctorate, alhamdulillah. So, yes, there is this very strong trend towards harmonization later on in the tradition. It does get very, very strong. However, there is a very strong recognition, nonetheless, that Plato is the superior philosopher and that Aristotle is a student of Plato, and a bit of a naughty one at that. But earlier on, well, when you look at Middle Platonism, one book which I would highly recommend is Alcinous' Handbook of Platonism. Actually, one of the great scholars that I'm very lucky in our seminar at Cambridge, weekly Plato seminar that we have at the Divinity Faculty at the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism. We have, which we're actually working on a project with them at Taba, which is on a different topic, but we have a weekly seminar which is filled with some of the greatest scholars of Platonism in the world, without exaggeration. And one of them is John Dillon, who's now in his 80s, and he is one of the most important living scholars of Platonism. And he translated this work by Alcinous, the Handbook of Platonism, which is a work of Middle Platonism, before Plotinus, who's seen as the founder of so-called Neoplatonism. And this is a comprehensive work of Platonism, everything, ethics, psychology, metaphysics, and so on. It doesn't call it metaphysics, but now what Alcinous does is he just basically takes everything good that Aristotle did, and he says actually Plato was the origin of that, sometimes stretching that in ways which are a little bit far-fetched. For example, he won't admit that it's Aristotle who formalized logic. He must admit it on some level, but he tries to show that all of the forms of the syllogism, all of the ashkal, are there in Parmenides, and then he shows you, and they are there. So, he tries to show the kind of underlying structure more systematic structure of Plato. But Alcinous, it's a wonderful book. If you want to get a very, very brief, I mean, I think the whole thing is 30 pages, and then John Dillon's commentary is like 150 pages. If you just want a kind of overview, quick overview of what does a Platonic philosophy look like, it's good. It's by no means exhaustive, but it's a good basic thing to look at because it's just comprehensive and brief. But it's I don't want to say it's not sophisticated, but it's really, I mean, it's frankly, it's very crude compared to Plotinus. And it's very basic. And that's not to cast any aspersions on Alcinous, but it's just not when you go to Plotinus, you get someone who is almost on the level of Plato and Aristotle. And of course, I acknowledge that Aristotle was an extraordinary mind. I mean, it would be ludicrous not to. Plotinus is, I mean, I rate him much higher than Aristotle, but I mean, in terms of not only mysticism, poetry, but logical ability, analytical ability, and breadth of metaphysical vision and rigor of analysis. I mean, he wipes the floor with Aristotle, frankly. If you look at 6:1-3 of the Enneads, which no one ever looks at, by the way, it's absolutely extraordinary. He's critiquing Aristotle's categories from a Platonic perspective. And then in 6:2, he's putting forward his own Platonic understanding of the supreme genera of the intelligible world. And it's absolutely extraordinary. Anyway, the point is, very long-winded way of saying this, but Plotinus indeed is an anti-Aristotelian Platonist. And he's often considered to be the last anti-Aristotelian Platonist, which is actually not true, but you will see that thing bandied around that he's the last anti-Aristotelian Platonist because they all went crazy for harmonization afterwards. But he's, I mean, he really is in a different, there are some who would question this, but I believe he's in a completely different league and to the later Neoplatonists. And he's also someone whose doctrines are very amenable to Islam. Why are we doing all this philosophy stuff? If you have a Sufi sheikh and you have a strong yaqeen and so why would you, well, you don't actually need to, if that is the case. But even someone in that situation might need to, if they were faced with certain problems, which even with a strong yaqeen and a good sheikh, they might be led astray by, simply because they might see the haqa'iq, but they can't recognize the manifestations of different beliefs in concepts, in philosophies. They can't necessarily recognize the asl of that or what it is really saying, such that they might tend to adopt doctrines or understandings or interpretations which are really desperately antithetical to Islam and which can't be justified on any level. This is a problem. You might be able to see the truth. You recognize with yaqeen the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You recognize with yaqeen that the Prophet ﷺ is the perfect human being who is the last prophet, seal of the prophets, who comes with the perfect sharia for all of mankind. You might see that with perfect. Now, the great arifs billah, am I going to say they need philosophy? Of course they do. They're totally munazzah on a need for philosophy. And it would be ludicrous for me to say that they need philosophy. And I would say with, if we're talking about awliya, with the God-given discernment, they won't fall into any error because of the makhazi of the age that we're in. But if let's say, you know, people like us who are the followers, hopefully, of those people, no, you need a strong basis in, let's say, at least ilm al-kalam. You need a strong basis in mantiq, because otherwise little arguments can creep in and you don't even notice that they've come in. I once said to a great wali that you know, the work we're doing is so important because you know, there are many Muslims now who insist that they are not affected by modern thought, and that it's just not an issue for them, and it's all, what are you guys wasting your time for? Everything's intact. And that they have no need for it, but they're actually affected by those things. I said that's why our work is so important, because they are affected by the doctrine. And he said to me, he said they, in the course of formulating what they're saying, they're mutabanni of those doctrines. They're actually adopting those doctrines in formulating what they're saying. They're so unaware of it that they can't even realize that the basis of what they've said in talking to you is that doctrine, are those batil doctrines from modernism. So, you know, one example is certain doctrines of liberalism, the idea that essentially, because someone wants to do something, they should have the freedom to do so. So the freedom to engage in to have a certain style of life, type of lifestyle, to live in a way that absolutely, in Islamic terms, the sanctity of the individual as a human being must be respected, regardless of what they do. But then the idea that, well, in a secular society where Muslims have to uphold the laws, and that's absolutely true, it's not right for us to put forward Islamic doctrines about right and wrong lifestyles, because ultimately it is the freedom of the individual to choose whatever they want to choose. That is part of their conscience as an individual, is that you know, part of the freedom of conscience is that they have looked at the fact and they say, well, yes, this is the way that I want to live my life. I consider that to be correct. And we Muslims as a faith community, sure, we don't agree with that, but it would be wrong of us to ever say, this is, you know, capital W wrong, this is metaphysically wrong. It's not just in our belief that it's wrong, but it is intrinsically wrong. It would be wrong for us to present that face, because now we've already got a wrong definition of freedom that we've accepted, but because we don't really know whether it's wrong. Now, there's a very subtle thing there, because the same person is saying, well, we do really know it's wrong by faith. The Quran says, it's not the Quran, Hasha, but it says, the Quran says that it's wrong, and we have a strong yaqeen that, you know, we believe in our religion, and the Quran says it's wrong, so yes, it's wrong. But then on the level of the intelligibility of reality accessible to the Muslim and the non-Muslim, can we really know that it is wrong, such that we can expect the non-Muslim and even do ilzam of the non-Muslim in our discourse? Of course, as is well known, you can't cite the Quran to a non-Muslim and expect them to, for that to mean anything. Can you make a rational argument that that lifestyle is wrong? Now, the attitude which is excessively faith-based and is highly problematic, because it takes those assumptions, epistemological, metaphysical assumptions from the West without knowing it, says, no, we can't, we can never bring that up with them because it's a faith position. It's because we're Muslims that we believe in that. It's not because there's anything that they can see that is intrinsic to reality, which would make that the case. So yeah, that's just one example, which you see everywhere. And I'm not just saying, you know, the kind of, you know, sweet taxi driver, you know, some of them have PhDs in Jordan without exaggeration, because they can't find work in Jordan. But, you know, the type, but so forgive me for saying taxi driver as if it implies some sort of level of thaqafa, which it doesn't. But I'm just saying, you know, very often, literally, I would get in a taxi in Jordan. And, you know, very unlike England, it's rather pleasant. You get in and you start having this, you know, metaphysical conversation about the samawati wal ard and everything and our place in it, and, you know, how wonderful Islam is, with the, you know, which you're not going to find usually with a black cabbie driver in England. So it'd be very unusual. So, but what you hear again and again is another one of these very frightening things. They'll say, you know, to be honest, they're Muslim taxi drivers and other people you meet, but it's especially poignant, the taxi driver, because you're stuck with this person for 20 to 30 minutes. And they say, you know, I've got loads of friends who are Christian. Wallahi, they're better behaved than we are. You know, they're really nice people. They help people. They're good people. And what comes across very, very clearly is that the man believes that Christianity is a legitimate path in the way that it exists now. Again, because of this assumption of the metaphysical unknowability of the truth of Islam. Can't really know, so, but you know, you see the evidence of good behavior. So at the end of the day, that's what God's looking at, right? He's looking at your good behavior. So that's what it's all about. And you see that all over the place. So why do we need metaphysics? The revelation has come, but are we able to receive it and to understand really what it's saying? Why? Because we as human beings, we have an interface. We, with our cognitive apparatuses, with our social relations that we exist in, we are an interface receiving the revelation. In any case, we have an interface, you know, we're never, we can't be frightened ever of philosophy or exploring the possibilities of the mind. You know, people like Fakhruddin Razi, after he became an imam in the Ma'qulat, and that has a specific meaning. It means he went through everything and mastered everything. He said, I came back to the Quran and I saw all of the truth that I had seen glimmers of in, of course I'm paraphrasing, but in philosophy, clearer and better and more powerful in the Quran. You might have thought, well, he became so sophisticated, he'd then go to the Quran, hash al-Quran, and say, oh, well, I mean, it's just written in the 6th century. You know, he doesn't know about cosmology and metaphysics and epistemology and all that. Sadly, you see that attitude, which is frankly disbelief. I mean, one can't think that, but you see that attitude implied, ironically, in those people who are so scared of philosophy, as if somehow, you know, all that sophistication is going to make you come to the Quran and say, well, this is not really that good. But it's the more sophistication, the more mastery you have of whatever field it is, you will go to the Quran. That's why it stood the test of time, and one of the innumerable reasons, because the scholar goes to the Quran and they say, well, look at this feast of knowledge and the meanings which are interconnected, which have such profundity of meaning, so many possibilities that all fit together so coherently. And you can come, you know, with your head full of advanced metaphysics, and you see it all in the Quran, but it taking you to a higher place, correcting it even. But if you don't have, if you haven't recognized there is a level of human interpretation of the world, and so you're not recognizing the existence of philosophy. So when you receive a philosophy which is batil, you don't even know that it's a philosophy. You might import all sorts of things which you shouldn't have imported just because you didn't realize this is a nazaria which يقبل, it could be true or false. You don't have any way to analyze it. So when you have a metaphysics which accords with the revelation, then you have a way to evaluate. It's not an alternative to the revelation. Revelation is coming down to us. Metaphysics is a human way, if you want to put it like this, of going up to the revelation, of receiving the revelation.